So for the interested time, as people are still logging on, I'm just going to start with, introductions and housekeeping, and we can move on from there. I do see that we had a couple people log on, and I had wanted to thank everybody for joining us. For those of you who do not know, January is Human Trafficking for Prevention Month. And we at the New Hampshire Lodging and Restaurant Association are incredibly grateful to be able to work with both Donna and Brian, to learn from their expertise and to collaborate to provide this training opportunity to the hospitality community. This is a really important topic, and we're really happy to have both of you here with us today to learn more about this. Just some little housekeeping for everybody online. Questions are going to be answered at the end, unless there's going to be a couple of points where they'll specifically state that they'd like feedback at the moment. But if you can put the questions in the Q&A, and we'll be going over them at the end of the presentation. So just to start off, some introductions. Donna Plord serves as the Chief Operating Officer at the Light of Light, which is a nonprofit committed to serving women experiencing the challenges of past abuse and trauma, substance use disorder, and homelessness and exploitation. Then Brian Bessette is also with us today. He's the Executive Director of the Freedom Cafe in Durham, New Hampshire. The Freedom Cafe of Durham is a nonprofit specialty cafe dedicated to ending human trafficking and the commercial exploitation of all people. The cafe provides a collaborative space that invites local and community to engage on the issues and take action towards a traffic-free world. Again, thank you both for joining us. I'm going to turn things over to them so they can tell you a little bit more about themselves, their organizations, and we can learn more about how we can help with human trafficking in New Hampshire.
Thanks so much, Samantha, for having us this morning. Brian, would you like to begin with your introduction, and then I can do mine as we ease into the rest of the slide deck that we have today?
Sure. Yeah. Samantha did a great job kind of introducing myself in the cafe. But a number of years ago, I was working as a chaplain and an adjunct faculty at the university, working on issues or doing a class on ethics, and it began to really investigate and explore the reality of human trafficking. My entry point was connecting with victims of bonded slavery in Nepal. And very soon after taking a trip and working with survivors of trafficking in Nepal, came back to New Hampshire and discovered that trafficking was equally happening in both labor trafficking and commercial sex exploitation here in the state. And taking on this issue and bringing awareness to it both globally and locally became really important to myself and a team of us at the university. And we came up with this crazy idea to start a cafe where we collect donations to raise awareness and support for addressing the issue of human trafficking and commercial exploitation. And it's grown. It's resonated with people around our local region and far beyond. And honored to be a part of the New Hampshire Task Force. Honored to have been able to work with Donna and to really become a leader and a force for bringing change on this issue in the state of New Hampshire.
Thanks, Brian. It's been awesome working with you over these years on the task force and in other capacities as well. And the work that I do, I've been involved in anti-trafficking efforts since 2006. And more specifically now, I am the Chief Impact Officer at Light of Life. And what that looks like is we have a number of different programs. One is a residential program, 9 to 12 months, for women who are coming out of different life controlling issues, really. As Samantha mentioned, that could be experiencing homelessness. It could be someone who's has dealt with substance use disorder, a lot of past trauma and abuse. And also what we do there is provide a safe environment, a welcoming space where people can begin to heal, can begin to get connected to the different resources that they need so that they can have that safety and stability so that they're able to then start to look at what would they like their future to look like. And what that involves many times is again, getting connected to therapy, if that's something that would be important to them, but also looking into educational and training, job training opportunities, with the goal being that they be able to set those goals for themselves and also be self-sufficient after that after they graduate the program. We also have our walk-in center called Revive that's open to ladies. We do a street outreach on a regular basis every week, and the ladies can come in and just it's a warm, welcoming space where you can just engage in conversation. We do a lot of art. We find it's really kind of a neat way to, one, get outside of your head, but also really just, it fosters those natural conversations, because we do find that one of the main keys to this work is building relationships and building trust with women who have very, very good reasons not to trust. And so that, we hope, will be an opportunity to invite them in as we go forward into some of the programs we offer, whether that's support groups, music therapy, different book studies that we have done, and of course make referrals to other services, including our residential program, which is called the Lighthouse. And soon, in the next week or so, we will be opening the new emergency shelter in Manchester, which is called Beacon on Brook. And that will be just for women and their children. As is our residential program, actually. The ladies can have their children with them if they have custody. And that emergency shelter will be certainly a means to be in out of the cold. As we all know, it's just really difficult circumstances, and especially in the winter. But also there'll be opportunities for, they'll serve a hot breakfast and dinner each night, and they'll be able to access different programming, including Celebrate Recovery, AA and NA, and other programs that are offered at our walk-in center. We also have an educational and training arm, and that's where I connected with Brian back in the day as we both became members of the task force. And so again, thank you so much for having us this morning. We think that this is really a critical need, that the excuse me, Lodging and Restaurant Association and all of those that are connected in the hospitality field really be aware of what's happening, not only across the nation, but right here in our own state. And so our objectives today are to really expand our understanding of what is human trafficking, what does it actually look like, and what are the underlying dynamics. Basically, how is it happening? To learn the nature and scope of what we're seeing right here in our own state, to recognize pertinent indicators and red flags that you might see in your work and in your various roles, and then discover what can be done. How do we take action? What to look for in your job, but also how to respond more specifically in a very trauma-informed way, for example, and what the connections or contacts are right here in the state that could be helpful to you in your work. So basically, why are we here? As I said, I really do feel that you're on the forefront of much of this work. And so to be able to be equipped and engaged in the efforts to combat human trafficking is really key. I think that there are primarily a couple of reasons specifically as far as why a training for your group in particular. And one of them is that absolutely, human trafficking is happening not only in restaurants, but there certainly is hotel involvement. According to a study that was put out by Polaris, which is a nationally recognized anti-human trafficking organization, who actually, they also run the hotline, the national hotline for trafficking. According to that survey, survivors of human trafficking said that 75% said that they had contact with a hotel during their trafficking experience. And so some of what that could look like is, they said that 80% of commercial sex was occurring in a hotel. And that might take a couple of different forms. There could be what we call an in-call, where someone is based in a room in a hotel and individuals are coming to them. And we're going to talk about some of the things that you might see. And kind of contrary to public perception, I think, or common misconception, is that it's only happening at lower end hotels, perhaps with subpar accommodations. And I'd like to say that that can be the case, but that's absolutely not the only way that that's playing out. We've seen it across the boards from those lower end hotels up until the higher end chains that can be involved as well. Because what a trafficker is looking for is a place that's, one, convenient to get to, but also there's a certain amount of buyer comfort there that they recognize as important. They, of course, take into consideration the price, and they're also thinking about things like, what are the hotel procedures and protocols? What does the security and infrastructure look like? What's the ease of access into the rooms? Things like that. Is there an active local police presence where there might be some monitoring going on? So they're very cognizant of those things, but what they're looking for is a balance, right, of being able to offer some quality and a decent price, but also with that anonymity and safety for themselves to reduce the risk. And so all of those considerations are something that a trafficker would be cognizant of. And so an in-call, and we're going to talk about these indicators more specifically, is when, again, someone is coming in to meet someone at the hotel, specifically for, in this case, commercial sex. Now, it can also look like an out-call, and what happens there is where an individual is contacted and requested to come to the hotel. That might be a little bit more difficult to detect, only because there's more of a limited time at the hotel that they're spending, less interaction with staff, for example. And but it might look like someone coming in, maybe you see the same person coming in and over the course of a day or two or a few days, and going to different rooms. That might happen. There may be a situation where you're noticing that someone's being dropped off for maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, and then picked up. But there also could be someone that stays on the property, whether that's in the lobby or in the car, that seems to be waiting for that individual. And another indicator might be that the room was booked using a business card, but then it's paid for in cash. So all that to say, in the experience of the victims that were in this particular survey, 80% of commercial sex, whether it be in-call or out-call, was occurring at a hotel. 69% say that during their trafficking experience, the hotel was used during travel at some point. 47% said that they sought shelter at a hotel themselves during an exit. 20% said the trafficker housed the victim at a hotel. 18% that they lived there independently during their experience. 4% said there was actual hotel involvement in the case of actually being the trafficker of that particular victim. Whoops, sorry, I hit the wrong thing. And 3% said that the victim was trafficked by a hotel subcontractor. That, again, we'll talk about that a little bit further as far as hiring practices and what that might look like. So that's one of the main reasons, the fact that it's actually happening in our restaurants, it's happening in our hotels. The second reason is that there's liability that we need to be aware of. And so, according to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was expanded in 2008 to include these provisions, and when a hotel knowingly rents a room for the purpose of commercial sex, or perhaps should have known, that might be the case, they can be held liable in a civil lawsuit. So, for example, a hotel basically is risking liability, civil liability, that is, if they're not aware or they're simply ignoring the clear indicators. So the onus is on the hotel workers, on the staff, on the management, to make sure that you are aware of the indicators, because no longer is it okay to say, well, I didn't know, I didn't recognize. It's really important. And some of the chains are instituting, or have been for quite some time, that training that is needed for their staff. But again, we're providing that today, but not everybody has access to that training. But it's really important. And again, it's no longer an option to say we weren't aware. Just to give you an idea, there are a few different cases that I can relate. There's one in New York that involves a situation where a number of young girls were housed in this particular hotel and would come to the front desk on a regular basis, maybe to pick up delivery, like Chinese food or something like that. Also to pick up condoms when they ran out from a communal bowl. There were a number of guests that were going repeatedly into these rooms in high numbers. And there was a situation where, and that would be non-paying guests, of course, and there was a situation where there was some physical abuse that had happened to a young woman. She was well, a young girl, she was 10 at the time, that again, when she walked by the front desk, it was clearly a situation where there had been something that had happened there. And so she became the main plaintiff of this particular case. And again, there were individuals coming in and out on a regular basis. The girls were there for a number of days. The rooms were strewn with used condoms, for example, and the hotel did nothing to intervene at this point, or even to report a suspicion. There's also a case currently in Columbus, Ohio, where it's actually a federal case now, where they've allowed other victims to join this particular lawsuit because of the fact that the hotels involved are the same chains. So it may have happened out of state, not necessarily in Ohio, but we're talking now 1,000 victims and 40 different hotels, including the major chains that are represented in this particular suit. And the allegations really range from basically a negligence in preventing human trafficking all the way to active facilitation of trafficking. And so again, just to give you an idea of what is currently happening, there's also a case in New Hampshire that's currently undergoing litigation where a woman who was trafficked through 4 different major hotel chains, different entities that they owned throughout the state on a regular basis, where she was seen at these hotels repeatedly over a course of time from the year 2016 to 2018. She would repeatedly visit. There would be 6 to 10 individuals visiting her room on a regular basis. And there were many times that she exited the hotel in front of the front desk, crying while her trafficker was yelling at her. So there were definitely signs that there was something that was happening that were totally overlooked or ignored. And so she again has filed this suit. Again, it's currently being litigated in the state. But just again, to bring that home, we need to be aware that these things are happening and that liability is certainly an issue that we need to be cognizant of.
So we're going to dive into a basic definition. I'm certainly seeing the impact, the liability, the reality that this is important for our hospitality industry. So what is specifically human trafficking? Firstly, it is a human rights violation. It is a crime of overcoming an individual's will through force, fraud, or coercion. And compelling them to engage in some kind of labor, whether that's traditional labor, domestic servitude, commercial sex acts. And so there's a lot of myths and misunderstandings about human trafficking built into the law. There has to be, for anyone over 18 years old, an ability to demonstrate that there was force or fraud and coercion. Force is, I think, pretty easy to understand. It's something. It could be violence, threat of violence, fraud. So many trafficking situations begin with a lie, with an opportunity that sounds, maybe really good, and then it turns into something that is destructive and harmful. Coercion would be emotional manipulation and creating opportunities to control and exploit victims. So traffickers use these forms of force and fraud and coercion specifically to control, specifically to exploit. It might include imposing debt, fraudulent employment opportunities, false promises of marriage or a better life. It might include psychological coercion, violence, threats of violence. And I think it's important to understand that traffickers and their victims can be of any age, any race, any ethnicity, sex, gender identity, nationality, immigration status, socio-economic background. Certainly there are groups of people who have an incredible amount of vulnerability and maybe have faced a lot of oppression or a lack of opportunity in their life and maybe more easily targeted. But cases of trafficking have impacted all numbers of people. And traffickers could be a relative, a friend. Trafficker could be operating alone or as part of a network, a criminal organization. And human trafficking occurs in both legal and illegal industries, and it could intersect with drug trafficking, with gangs, with money laundering, with domestic violence and sexual assault. So it's really important that we understand the dynamics of trafficking and are able to identify those signs, as we'll be walking through today. It's also important to note, and I sort of mentioned it a little bit earlier, that in terms of proving that the crime of human trafficking has happened, if someone is under the age of 18, force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of commercial sex is not required to be proven. So labor and services, as I mentioned, that fraudulent employment opportunities, people are often lured through the promise of like a legitimate opportunity. Give an example. I work at the intersection of the University of New Hampshire, and so this case that occurred at Emory University in Georgia is one that's really helpful to for a lot of our constituents to grasp. A young woman was out at a club, met a gentleman dancing, and he had a business card and said, "Hey, I am working on a music video for a band, and I'm looking for some extras for this. I think you have a great look, you have a great perspective, and I'd love to have you involved. Here's my card. If you think that you're interested, we're going to be recording next weekend, and I'd be happy to chat." And then also slipped in there, don't spread the word too big. This is a really limited opportunity, so I think you're the right person for it, but feel free to check in if you'd like to get the job. And so this young woman, who was under the normal stress of a student, to pay for school, to pay for books, to make things work for herself, decides I'm going to take a check. I'm going to call this guy up. And they ended up meeting at a small coffee shop. They went over the paperwork for hiring. She gave him her W-4 and her family's information. He said, "All right, I'll see you, over the weekend." And when she went out to this location, it was a little off the beaten path. She ended up going in. She didn't tell any friends. She didn't tell any family members. She was keeping the whole thing kind of to herself. And when she got into that space, she was given a drink. It was drugged, and she was immediately brought into a place of exploitation. And then the trafficker used coercion to specifically keep her in the trafficking situation, where he said, "Hey, I know where your family lives. I know you have a young brother. I will, do violence to your family, violence to your brother if you try to get out, if you try to tell the authorities about what's going on." And so this young woman was serving in commercial sex nightly at the command of this trafficker for a couple of years. And it wasn't until another student was tried to be manipulated and frauded into a similar situation that talked to authorities that this little ring was busted. And so that concept of being lured by a false promise takes so many different perspectives. You can see on the slide here: domestic service, landscaping, restaurants, hotels, agriculture, construction, cleaning crews, health and beauty, panhandling, traveling sales crew. These are some of the prominent areas where labor and services people are being exploited in those industries. I think it's also important as you think about your work in a hotel, a restaurant, that beyond just your work with hiring someone, a lot of the ways in which trafficking takes place are through subcontractors. And so you may unwittingly or unknowingly contract with a vendor, and it could be a cleaning crew that may seem legitimate on the surface. In talking to our Department of Labor services here in the state of New Hampshire, they have seen cleaning crews who the traffickers are recruiting people to work in those industries, and sometimes even placing the name of the business in the name of trafficking victim. And the services are changing so quickly and registering with the state so quickly that they're unable to keep up with the legitimate paperwork and insurance that due diligence is being done. And I guess an example, one of the things that really hit home for me when I mentioned earlier that I worked with bonded slavery, folks who had been survivors of bonded slavery in Nepal, and it was soon after coming back to New Hampshire that there was a case of trafficking in Durham, New Hampshire, in a place where they were building the cottages, which was a student housing project. And it's exactly what we're talking about here, where the contractor and the architect and the organization who was building this had contracted out certain businesses to be a part of the construction service. And of course, timelines are easy to miss. And so a contractor might subcontract out some of that work. And a couple of layers down, a group of Guatemalan gentlemen were here on legitimate working papers, and they were building and working in the construction. And they had been promised a particular wage and payment, and that was not coming through. They had their papers all taken away so that if they went to complain to any law enforcement, they'd be at risk or a fear of being deported. And so this organization, eventually one of the gentlemen got a hold of the American Friends program and shared the story of working for weeks without pay, being stuck in a small apartment with four other guys, and not having an opportunity to have any movement or freedom and resources. And there was a big march around the town of Durham, and it was shocking to find out that right here in our small town in New Hampshire, that there was this kind of exploitation going on. So it's important to understand that we have a due diligence to do, even as we are looking through the list of subcontractors. Again, the most common forms of labor trafficking in New Hampshire would include domestic service, in the hospitality industry, housekeeping, restaurant and kitchen work, and in construction and cleaning services.
As Brian mentioned in the basic definition, someone is being compelled to either provide labor or a service or a commercial sex act. And I think that it's important to understand what that might involve, because I think the first thing that comes to mind many times when we think of a commercial sex act is prostitution. And absolutely, we're seeing individuals being trafficked, whether that's street prostitution, in hotel work, residential brothels, for example, truck stops, escort services, but it goes beyond prostitution as well. I know of individuals who were filmed during their exploitation, and those films were uploaded without their permission. And so pornography can be heavily involved as well. It's also used as a training mechanism, so to speak, to help individuals know what the expectations will be. We've also seen individuals who have been trafficked into live entertainment. That could be working in a strip club. It could also be, I know of someone personally who had a very good friend, and her introduction to trafficking came through being compelled to perform at bachelor parties and that type of entertainment as well. And then we're seeing an increase in webcamming, as you can imagine, through the pandemic. But even before that, a situation where certain performance is requested, and then the financial arrangements are facilitated online, and that has been escalating. You know, there's a layer of anonymity there, and we're seeing not only adults, of course, but in all of these things, youth involvement as well. And so, again, something to be aware of as far as expanding our idea of what a commercial sex act might actually include. And one important part of this definition is that it is commercial. The sex act is being performed in exchange for something of value. And of course, that can be cash, but it also could be gift items. It could be as simple as something to eat or a place to stay, or it could be drugs. And then, as Brian mentioned earlier, according to both federal and state law, if an individual is a minor, they cannot consent to a commercial sex act. And there is also no need to prove force, fraud, or coercion. So in this, what that looks like, basically, in the state of New Hampshire, the age of consent is 16. But if you're under 18, you cannot consent to a commercial sex act where something of value is being exchanged. And Brian is going to share further a little bit more about force, fraud, or coercion. But with someone under the age of 18, we do not need to prove that those elements were involved. And then in New Hampshire, what we're seeing primarily when it comes to a commercial sex act is residences involved, hotels, and also massage businesses. There have been a number of networks, for example, where an owner may own 4 or 5 different businesses, and they're facilitating trafficking through those enterprises. But predominantly, these are the 3 forms of commercial sex that we're seeing when it comes to trafficking victims in the state of New Hampshire. Ryan, you're muted.
Thanks, Donna. So again, we've delved into the definitions a bit of force and fraud and coercion. So to review that, force, use of restraints and confinement, abduction, use of drugs. We do see these things. These are the kinds of things that come up so much in movies and social media, and it is a reality, and it does happen in the world, but it is certainly in our experience in the States not the most dominant initially form of bringing someone into human trafficking. So much more often that it begins with fraud, it begins with deception, it begins with false promises and false conditions of employment, false opportunities for a good life and a good paying future. And support and security, and then it morphs into as the victim has groomed and understood or as the trafficker has groomed and really understood the victim, taking advantage of those vulnerabilities, which we'll get more into shortly. It becomes psychological threats, blackmail, manipulation. That coercion can really create a sense of ensnarement with a trafficker. And so just to give you a sense of some of the things that we've been seeing in the state of New Hampshire, we've seen in all 10 counties sex and labor cases in urban and rural areas. So this is not isolated. Again, like that reality that certain demographics may be more vulnerable or more visible. Certain places and certain areas within the state are maybe more hotspots, but that doesn't mean that the rest of us don't need to pay attention and don't need to be aware, because it is happening around us. So one of the most challenging realities is that the second case of labor trafficking that was prosecuted in the United States after the passage of the Trafficking Victims Act in 2000 took place in Litchfield, New Hampshire. And you see this picture of the Bradley Tree company. Bradley and Odell had used false promises of good work and pay to recruit 4 Jamaican men to bring to New Hampshire to work in their tree service. They were promised that they would make $11 to $15 an hour, and they went through all of the channels to get their proper paperwork. And once they arrived, they were only paid $8 an hour. And Bradley and Odell forced these gentlemen to live in a tool shed and in a trailer in their backyard without adequate heating or plumbing. And also beyond that, charged each of them $50 per week for rent. The men were threatened with serious harm and had physical restraint and psychological coercion kind of to keep their labor and services going. They even confiscated the victims' passports and their tickets so that they couldn't return home to Jamaica. At one point, Bradley physically assaulted one of the men by choking, striking, and kicking him. And then as the person fled, Bradley ordered his German Shepherd to attack him. The Bradley and Odell denied the men proper medical care when the men were injured while working. One of them had sustained a serious cut on their finger working a wood chipper, and they were refused to take him to a hospital. My understanding is that the case broke when one of the gentlemen broke out the back of the trailer and made their way to a hospital to get treated and opened up about the situation. And so it's, again, hard to imagine that something like this is happening in New Hampshire, but it is happening anywhere where people are able to be taken advantage of, victimized, and exploited for the benefit of another person's finances or resources or growth. So a second case, more recently in 2021, Stephen Tucker in Manchester had been selling heroin to numerous individuals, including young women and a minor. The witnesses describe how Tucker used their addiction to recruit them and cause them to prostitute for his profit. Tucker would give heroin for free to women and then arrange prostitution dates for them. The women were required to give Tucker half of the proceeds and then purchase heroin from him with the remainder of the money. On other occasions, Tucker would withhold heroin from the women, causing them to suffer withdrawal symptoms, and then instructed them to prostitute themselves out in order to earn money to purchase heroin. And so Tucker's scheme really guaranteed that he had a steady source of drug customers and money. And some of the women were required to help Tucker sell the heroin, receive heroin in exchange. Tucker used the heroin as a means of control, then violence and threats to maintain control. And so again, certainly, bringing back to some of the things that Donna said, how many of those women connected at some point with a hotel here in the state of New Hampshire? And what could we do as business owners, as leaders, as trained staff to identify and begin to help open up an opportunity for someone to boot them out of the situation that they're trapped in?
And so basically, we're going to take a few minutes here to kind of explore how is this happening? What contributes to vulnerability, and what are the recruitment and control tactics? Because I think that having that underlying understanding of those dynamics is really important to be able to expand our ability to recognize the indicators when we see them. So I've heard human trafficking defined also as the exploitation of vulnerability. And some of those vulnerability factors, this is what that could look like, what could contribute. As Brian said earlier, no one is immune, regardless of all of those things that Brian mentions, such as age, for example, but even as far as gender identity, race, socioeconomic status, all of those things are, but some groups are at higher risk, and they would include individuals who have a history of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. There was actually a study that was done in Florida that involved over 900 children, and they found that the number one indicator of child sex trafficking was a history of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. And so very much something to be mindful of. And a contributing factor specifically for someone to be more vulnerable to exploitation. Individuals who are runaway homeless and missing because there's a reason that someone has run away. So many times that's certainly not adventure seeking. Sometimes that's running away from an abusive circumstance. Individuals that are experiencing homelessness, or if they're missing, is there someone that's looking for them? And so again, out on the street, potentially very vulnerable circumstances. If they've had engagement with the foster care system, child protective services, or the juvenile justice system. A number of trafficking survivors, according to one study, said that they had had at least one placement in foster care. And again, it just shows the contributing factors that are there and how an unstable home life can potentially contribute, or an abusive situation can contribute to that vulnerability. We see individuals who identify as LGBTQ are disproportionately represented when it comes to trafficking victims specifically. They're definitely at higher risk. Many times have experienced discrimination, harassment, may not have family support or social support, and are very much at risk. Those individuals who are struggling with substance misuse. I think there's a misconception sometimes that individuals that may be engaged in prostitution, for example, are doing so in order to support their drug use. I'm not here to say that that might not be the case, but many times we have found that this is a vulnerability that a trafficker can use to their advantage. As Brian just said in the Stephen Tucker case in Manchester, that was absolutely one example of what we've seen right here in our own state. But many times what can happen is if someone is struggling with substance use, the trafficker can become their supplier of choice and then use that to manipulate them further and keep them under their control. There is a statistic out there that 84.3% of individuals who have been trafficked for either labor or sex have mentioned that they, or reported that they used either drugs or alcohol or both during their exploitation experience. And of that 84.3%, 27.9, so basically 28%, reported that there was a forced introduction of drugs. They had not been using them previously, but the trafficker was someone who initiated that, because again, it's one of the most powerful forms of coercion that's available to a trafficker. And oftentimes the individuals are forced to sell drugs as well. And so there's the use, there's keeping them compliant. One of the most common ways to keep somebody compliant. And then potentially there's the addition of having to sell those drugs as well. Financial insecurity, whether that's for the individual or their family, can certainly contribute to vulnerability and that need to help support themselves. Are they struggling with mental health challenges? We see a lot of desperate situations, especially with individuals that are on the street, that again could be manipulated and used to a trafficker's advantage. Are there intellectual and developmental disabilities potentially? There was a case that was shared with the task force that involved a young woman who had come into one of the crisis centers, one of the shelters that the crisis centers operate here in New Hampshire. And as a staff member was helping her to unpack, she noticed that her clothing seemed to be pretty much what we might describe as provocative. Pretty much everything she had. And she just gently commented, looks like you have, a number of dressy clothes. And she said, my daddy buys them for me. He likes me to look nice when I go on dates with his friends. And thankfully, the staffer recognized that as a red flag. They investigated it. And unfortunately, she was being trafficked by her father on a regular basis. There may be language and cultural barriers when, when English is not your first language here, it's hard to necessarily be able to understand your rights as someone who is in the United States. There are maybe cultural barriers and other norms that can, again, affects someone's perception of what is happening, and maybe not being able to necessarily recognize a system of exploitation. And then more and more, we're seeing vulnerability really, really increasing by online means, social media, whether that's Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat. Back in the day, it might have been Facebook, maybe not so much now, but really, or even through gaming for that matter. Traffickers are very savvy. And so, looking to make those connections to click with somebody, maybe get into a private conversation with them through one of these entities, and then see where that goes and see if they can kind of grow a connection and build some trust, build a little bit of a relationship. And then, of course, with the goal being to meet in person at some point. And then, we can even look at social media potentially as something that, we kind of live in a comparison culture, and it can really fuel insecurity when you're, 24/7 being exposed to, maybe a relationship that I don't have, or material goods that I don't have, or activities that I don't get to enjoy with, things that we're constantly comparing, or the way that someone looks, for example. It can build insecurity in an individual. It can fuel that and make them potentially more open to someone who's willing to manipulate that to their advantage. I know someone in my extended family who is someone who puts everything out there on social media, everything. And so it's one of those situations where, I hate my life today. I've, had a fight with my boyfriend. I've, my parents are, just giving me a hard time about whatever the case may be. That's where somebody can come alongside and just be that person who has that listening ear. And we would hope that friends would do that, of course. But honestly, that can also be used as a way to kind of an entree, so to speak. And we're gonna look at that as we explore some of the recruitment and control tactics. And so how this happens is basically traffickers are very good to know what they're looking for, which are some of these vulnerabilities that we've just mentioned, for example, but they're also good at, like, what else? What might that look like? What are the hopes? What are the dreams? What are the goals of that person as they get to know them a bit? So they know what to look for, and they also know where to look. And so that might be something as simple as a coffee shop where a lot of people congregate. It could be sending somebody that's working for them and basically recruiting students at a school to come to a party. That can happen. But so it can be public settings, but it could also be situations where are some of these vulnerable people? Recovery meetings, sober living facilities, any group homes, things along those lines, where somebody that's maybe potentially recently come out of incarceration, there's a lot of ability there, and they are often targeted as well by a potential trafficker. And so once they make those initial connections, and kind of ascertain, is this going to be something that I might be able to use again? Is this an individual I might be able to manipulate to my advantage? It'll move into a grooming stage where that trafficker then becomes the solution to a felt need, right? So if they perceive that person needs some protection, they can become that protector. If they think that individual is looking for a relationship, aren't we all built for relationship? They can pretend basically that they're interested in a romantic relationship. That happens often. Are they looking for adventure in their life? I know someone that was trafficked that she said, I was just that bored 14-year-old in a small town, and they promised me, like, we'd go to Vegas, we'd get to do this, we'd get to do that. They can become that person. They could be the provider. Perhaps they have no one in their life that's watching over them, that's helping them make sure that they do have a place to stay. So again, they're building their relationship, they're building that trust, and they're becoming that solution to whatever the need is that they perceive that victim may have. And then once that relationship is built, it moves into more isolation. So what the goal is, they're trying to create more and more emotional and economic dependence. And so again, if they have any kind of social support or family support, they're going to try to alienate them from that. They don't get you. I'm the one that gets you, like, I'm here for you. I'll always be. Sometimes it might even look like a little bit of jealousy that can seem may be flattering at first, but it's a way of isolating that person. And so that they have no one to reach out to, for one, as those relationships, the longer that time goes on, it's harder and harder to have anybody that you feel you could reach out to for support if you recognize that you need that and there's something, what's wrong with this picture? But also, there's no one in your life that's noticing perhaps some of the changes, the more isolated you become too. And so that absolutely is a control tactic. Keeping somebody from anyone that may notice those changes is really important. And then it moves into control. And those are, of course, some of the things that we've already talked about, the force, fraud, and coercion, for example. One of the most common forms of control that we are seeing more and more in our state is actually someone being manipulated through what we would call blackmail or extortion, such as a sexting situation that, a certain picture was taken, and that once that picture was received, it was used as leverage for more and more pictures. It may end there sometimes, and sometimes it may not go beyond that at all. But on the other hand, we've had cases where that has then actually ended up where individuals have been coerced into a trafficking situation. We have a colleague on the task force who has met more than one woman, young woman, who was 15 years old, living at home, going to school, who had sent that picture, and in her situation, that had been used against her because, of course, they're threatening to disperse that picture to literally everyone she knows, which we all know is very easy to do once we have things that are, how easy it is to get a digital image out there, right? And this was not found out or stopped until she ended up in the ER because of some injuries that she had suffered. And that's where our colleague, who is a sexual assault nurse examiner, met with her. There's actually, just to show you how important it is to recognize that this is happening, there's actually a position that was created about 4 years ago now, maybe almost 5, with DCYF because of the level of trafficking of young people that we were seeing in the state. So there's a human trafficking specialist that works with DCYF now on cases such as the one I just described, and also in situations of familial trafficking, where some individuals that are in a family relationship with a victim are trafficking them for, it could be for rent money, it could be for drugs, or a variety of different things. And so they're controlled through force, fraud, and coercion, like I said, but also sometimes it's just these really arbitrary rules, very specific. I know of situations where they were told very specifically what they needed to wear, what color nail polish, things that don't always make sense. They were told when they can use the bathroom, when they can eat, where they can go, all of those different things. And partly, well, the main reason, let's say, for that type of behavior is because they're reinforcing the power dynamic, like who's in control here. And so more and more that individual has experienced those different tactics, that type of manipulation, sometimes that looks like, the cycles of intense affection and then abuse, and what kind of relationship I am. It leaves the victim second guessing their own judgment. And so just again, kind of getting a very brief overview of what that looks like and how it can happen is important to our understanding. And moving forward here, we'll get into more of the specific details as they relate to your profession in particular.
I think if you think back to the very beginning, we had some objectives, understanding the definition, the underlying dynamics of human trafficking, learning the nature and the scope of trafficking, primarily in New Hampshire. And we've kind of established those two objectives, and we want to move on to recognizing it's probably really easy to think this is the most important part of the presentation. But really understanding what trafficking is will help you to make better decisions as you see red flags and know what role you could play. And so I'd love for you to think for a moment, now that you've gotten a sense of what trafficking is, how it's defined, how traffickers operate in the world. Take a minute and think down, jot down. I know we're not in a a group setting where we're able to just chat with one another, but maybe even open up your chat window, and we'd love to hear from you. What do you think you should look for? And before we go right into the signs and the response methods, think about the job and the role that you have in a particular hotel, in the restaurant that you're working, in the bar. What might you observe? What might you hear? How might you identify some of the situations that we've discussed so far today? I'm just going to give you 90 seconds to think about that, and then we'll move forward. You might also take this moment to think about any questions that you have at this point in the conversation. We'll be tackling those questions later at the end, but maybe you have some just based around the definitions. So we'll move on. We'll look at some of the indicators. It's really important right off the top to say that this isn't a checklist. These are red flags. We have to take this into consideration that, one or more of these things could have many different reasons behind it. But when you see some of these indicators, it might create this moment in you where you think that's a red flag, that something doesn't look right, doesn't feel right, it's not sitting with me. And that gives us an opportunity to prick our consciences, to be a little bit more observant, and to pay attention and try to understand if a couple of these things are happening, then it might mean that we want to take some notes. We might want to ask some questions. We might want to think about how a response could be created. So let's talk through each one. I'm going to go right through the bullet points. The constant presence of someone who, in terms of the trafficking world, we would call a handler, a representative, someone who is taking care of all the communication, maybe taking care of all the paperwork, all the finances, someone who maybe the person seems like they could be an adult in the situation, taking care of themselves, but they are not able to have their own volition. And so someone else is there persistently restricting communication. And you may not notice this the first time that they're there, the second time, but maybe the third time. And you start to understand, oh, someone has a controlling presence here in this situation. There might be kind of on the flip side, someone claims to be an adult and appearance suggests that they are a minor. You may be aware, the New York Times has over the last few months been running a significant series of articles about children working in factories. That some of our big businesses have been implicated through meat, dairy, and candy. And a lot of the times these kids are coming in and giving false IDs and saying that they're older than they are because they need to make money to pay their rent, send money to family. And so it's possible for someone to be in a situation where they're claiming to be an adult and they're not. Another one is not being in possession or control of their ID or their money. There might be little or no communication or eye contact. And again, that might go back to that first one, always deferring every question to that representative, that handler. There may be signs of emotional, psychological distress. consistently feeling disoriented, confused, fearful, anxious, submissive. And again, these are red flags. They're not a checklist of someone is definitely being trafficked, but when you experience these things persistently and you begin to put the dots together that maybe something is going on, and you might feel even in your gut that something doesn't seem right. You might see physical signs of abuse, bruises, burns, cuts, scars. You might see signs of malnourishment or poor physical health or poor dental health. You might see actual tattoos or branding. And there's a photo here of some of those brands, not always visible to all of us, but traffickers do physically brand some of their victims. And so again, traffickers know and capitalize on the fact that staff and managers and executives in our hospitality industry often don't know what to look for. They don't know what questions to ask, even maybe during a contract negotiation with another vendor, or maybe completely unaware that human trafficking could be happening at their hotel. And so they're not looking for these signs, not looking for these indicators. Donna's going to delve a little bit more into some of the psychological indicators, some of the other indicators.
These are some of the indicators you might see, more specifically in a restaurant or hotel environment as well. Customers, including minors that are paying with cash or a preloaded credit card, if they can, it really helps to maintain that anonymity. And so they'll do that. That would be the payment of preference when it's possible. Perhaps they request rooms that are overlooking the parking lot or are close to exits. Are they entering and exiting on a regular basis through the side or rear entrances as opposed to through the lobby? Are they booking for an extended stay but seem to have few or even no personal possessions? There are times that someone may come in and maybe there isn't any luggage that's noticeable, so it's something to pay attention to. Are there frequent visitors to the same hotel room? Does there seem to be perhaps an individual that's loitering in the parking lot, the lobby, or hallways, and then returning to the room after a visitor leaves? Are there requests for room or housekeeping services, such as frequent requests for more bedding or towels? But then they're also denying entrance into the room. So they really don't want the room taken care of by housekeeping, but they will take, there is a need for bedding or towels. And then large amount if there's a possibility to come into the room to clean or for some maintenance or something like that, if you do have access, are there large amounts of cash that are noticeable, sexual paraphernalia, including potentially, again, a large or excessive number of used condoms, multiple laptops or cell phones or credit card readers even in the room that you might notice?
So again, we've talked about indicators, we've talked about red flags, we've talked about areas where you might feel a concern, you might have an instinct that something isn't right. So what do we do? First, you do not need to be sure of something. You don't need to see all the signs. If you think something isn't right, you have the ability and really, responsibility to report it. And that doesn't have to take away from your safety. So first and foremost, right off the top, every hotel or business really should have an internal protocol of what to do. And that makes it much easier for staff of any kind to feel comfortable, to feel confident, to feel safe making a report. Safety, of course, is never our responsibility to confront a suspected trafficker directly or to even alert a victim of your suspicions. We want to maintain a normal and routine appearance. It is not our responsibility as members of the hospitality industry to solve human trafficking. It's just our responsibility to be aware, to recognize, to report, and to let professionals who know how to deal with a situation deal with it well. So if there's a moment of feeling of imminent danger, of course, response number one is to call 911. If someone is at risk of experiencing harm, unless someone intervenes right away, if someone is potentially even being assaulted or in the middle of being assaulted, of course, 911 is our first responsibility. There's also local law enforcement and hotlines where we can report with tips and to report suspicious activity. So I've actually used the National Human Trafficking Hotline in the past, working with a young person in our school system right here in the seacoast, New Hampshire. And there were a lot of red flags and concerning indicators. And so myself and a couple of young people from the school went on a phone call, talked to the tip line. They helped us to process what we had seen and respond. And the benefit of that hotline is that we're not we would not be responsible to report these things in a court of law if a case went to a trial. We're giving a tip. We're sharing our what we've seen and what we've heard, and then the tip line is able to respond it directly to law enforcement that are working on cases of trafficking within our state. And something that it's helpful about those tip line, the national tip line, is that you might not be the only person who's reported a tip for a specific location. And when these tips come in, it can build a case that law enforcement might need to take a look into a situation. And we do have, and we will give you some specific ways to report right directly to folks working on the issue in the state of New Hampshire as well. So to get help for a victim, we want to have a basic understanding of the services and agencies that are available to provide crisis response to help connect victims. Again, we just kind of, I want to say it over again. It's right at the bottom of the notes. And I think it's so important. We're sharing all of this for you so that you can report it, so you can recognize and report, but you don't have the responsibility to stop human trafficking. You're not investigating. You're not questioning your residents. You're not putting yourself in danger. You are creating an opportunity for a victim to have someone appropriate create an opportunity for their freedom. So document. Anytime that you see these signs, and even if you're not making a report out right away, date and time of the suspected incident. Maybe you see something on one day of the week, but then the next week, you're in the same place, and around the same time you see a similar thing, and now it's starting to really feel like something that needs to be reported. Any concerns or red flags you've identified, share them with a manager who might be able to piece together these stories from various staff who've made similar observations. We're always encouraging staff to discuss the concerns with their colleagues. They may have spotted something similar, or they might reassure you that there's nothing actually going on. So pay attention to registration information, vehicle description, and license plates. That license plate that's coming over and over and over again of the guest who's visiting, an unpaying guest, phone numbers, credit cards, and information. Make notes of what people say, but don't ask them their story. Don't ask for more details. If someone discloses, listen, thank them for sharing and for raising those concerns, and document it in the way that they told you. So lastly, make notes of the descriptions of those who have been involved and physical identifiers, all these things that we just talked about indicators. Make notes on names, nicknames, overheard, summary of the situation. Save any trash that was taken from them. Save any surveillance footage. Note the date, the time, hallway, etc.
And then this is just a slide that we always include in our presentations so that we're aware. But every citizen in New Hampshire has a duty to report. So if you happen to come across some of these things, if you notice that there's, for example, a minor involved, someone under the age of 18, that would be a mandatory report or call basically to DCYF. We have these numbers for you on one of the later slides here. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this particular slide, but just know that this option, this is important information, and especially as it pertains to minors in regard to the work that you're doing, to be aware of. And so how can hotels help? We just want to make sure that we leave you with some concrete information about specific ways that hotels can make a tangible difference. And so if you don't already if you haven't already done so, implement a no cash policy. Again, like I mentioned earlier, that's one of the best ways to maintain anonymity. And so a no cash policy is really important whenever that's possible. Require the vehicle information and a photo ID at check-in. A lot of times that can be kind of lax. And so the more of these steps that you take into consideration, the more a trafficker is going to notice that this is not necessarily an easy access situation for us. There seems to be more monitoring, more security. Confirm the authenticity of staffing agencies, right? Especially anyone that's directly hiring employees, whenever that's possible. As Brian mentioned, it's not always easy to know the correct questions to ask, and traffickers are kind of dependent on that and hoping for that. But we want to make sure that, especially when English language is not their first language, we want to make sure that anyone who is hired is aware of their rights, has the support that they need, is aware of wage requirements, for example, hourly requirements, things along those lines. And so getting that confirmation or even reconfirming with any subcontractors especially is very important. Working with suppliers and vendors who responsibly source their products. And so more and more it's becoming less difficult, shall we say, to look into supply chains. Is there coffee we can choose to serve? Brian could definitely give you more information on this, and we won't have time today, but can we make choices about the coffee that we serve, for example? Can we make choices about the bedding? And some of this, of course, is handled at a chain level. We understand that. But there are opportunities that we all have in making purchases, but especially in these settings as we're talking about today, where we can do what we can to make sure that those supply chains are slave-free, are trafficking-free. Publicize that the hotel is trained, that you do hotel training, and that you have a protection policy, and post the national hotline number. I have to tell you, I was in New York recently, and the hotel we stayed at, at the front desk literally had an 8.5 by 11 sheet that was framed that talked about the fact that they do training for human trafficking and advertised the hotline number. And then in every hotel room on the back of the door, they also had some of the indicators, do you need help, that type of idea, with the hotline number there as well. And just so you'll know, sometimes we may think that, oh, I don't want our guests to think that that's happening here. I can understand that on one level, but on the other hand, I personally, well, you can imagine in the work we did, when I saw that, that was incredibly encouraging that that hotel was taking active means or measures to ensure the safety of their guests, all of their guests, right? And so that was Ace Hotel, just so you know, in New York City. And so getting that information out there is another way also of perhaps getting the hotline number into the hands of a victim that may need it, but it also alerts a potential trafficker. This isn't the environment you want to be in. We also know of different groups that are hosting, for example, or looking to host large conventions or conferences or things. And more, it's getting to the point where people are starting to, you know what are your policies about various things, including is there human trafficking training in this hotel? And so sometimes people will be that are decision makers for these types of events will be taking that into consideration, and we hope that that will happen even more often. So that's another benefit to a hotel who has decided to make this a priority. And then make sure that there is mandatory training for all staff, not just that the training is available, that the chain offers it, or that, even your individual hotel, if it's an independent entity, offers it, but that it actually happens, and that the training happens and there's follow-up, that there's additional training as new staff comes in, that there's refreshers, shall we say, to make sure that the staff stays up to date, and that you distribute and post fact sheets in staff areas about this. So those reminders are there, some of the indicators to look for, that type of thing. And then place informational brochures and posters, as I mentioned already, in the lobbies, in restrooms, in the elevators. It's a really good way to make sure that the employees and staff are current in their understanding of what trafficking may look like in their own environment, and also what they can do about it and how to report. Make sure that all of those things are fresh in their minds, so that when an incident does happen, it may not happen that often in certain hotels. So it could be easy to kind of really not have that information on the front burner, so to speak. And so making sure that those opportunities to review and having that information posted is really helpful, so that in the moment, it's not a scramble to find out, oh, what do we do about this? Having those protocols in place, who's the next in chain of command that I would share this information with, and that what's the follow through going to look like? And so here are some resources for you. You will all be getting, whoever wants it, will get a PDF of this slide deck, as well as the recording. And so you can take a look at some of these things. These are different resources for codes of conduct, for hospitality toolkits and protocols, sample protocols, if you don't already have one in your establishment. There's the information on training for a variety of these as well, further training that is offered. And then there are posters available too. The Blue Campaign specifically, you can get everything for free. So if you're looking for posters to put in your staff area, for example, with indicators, things along those lines, they are available for you. And then here is the contact information that would be valuable to have, and hopefully can get posted. The crisis centers in New Hampshire, if someone did disclose and needed help and support and potentially shelter, that would be a great number to call. DCYF, which we mentioned earlier, as far as any situation involving a minor. And then we have two individuals, Ron Morin and Dave McCormick, who work with law enforcement in our state, who are very, very trauma informed, and I don't say this lightly, they're wonderful in working with victims. So if there's a need to call someone in, and when there's a minor, you're going to make a call one way or the other if you see these certain indicators. But if it's an adult, that person has the right to choose, has agency, personal agency, if they want law enforcement to get involved. And we're talking something that's not an emergency situation, but if they want law enforcement to get involved, either of these individuals are really, again, very supportive and helpful. And then there's the Polaris hotline, as we've talked about a number of times, for tips that could be called in. Maybe you're not so sure, maybe it's just a suspicion, but you know what? They have people on, they're 24/7. They have people online that you can talk to, that can ask a few questions just to see maybe a little bit further what might be going on. And then, as Brian mentioned already, they know who to report to for law enforcement or service providers in the state. And so a very valuable number to be aware of. And there we are. I'll leave that one up.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. I did get a couple of questions in my emails, so if you don't mind me asking, just throwing a couple at you. One is, so Brian, would you talk a little bit more about the Freedom Cafe? I guess there was some interest in what exactly are you guys doing over there? I know we kind of did a quick what you guys are doing, but.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So we run a full functioning New Hampshire restaurant, Freedom Cafe. We serve coffee, tea, baked goods, house-made baked goods, crepes, and breakfast sandwiches. And everything that we serve here is served on a donation basis. We invite people to make a fair market donation. We recommend what that would be, and 100% of the proceeds beyond our cost of good, of course, go into programs and grants to address trafficking. Um, to like for those restaurant folks out there, we learned the model actually from Panera Bread. Panera had a series of nonprofit owned cafes for a while. Unfortunately, they've all closed at this point, but they were Panera Bread restaurants that were run by nonprofits for specific causes, and for them, they had their restaurants in areas that were a pretty broad socioeconomic demographic, and their hope was that some people of more means would donate more, people of less means would be able to donate less, and be able to everybody would be able to have a good sandwich, a good breakfast or lunch. We found that the model has worked really well in the college town. Students may or may not have a lot of money, but people feel good about making at least that recommended donation. We've been able to raise over the years over $160,000 to direct into programs to address trafficking. And in the meantime, or alongside of that, guests are building awareness that trafficking is happening. We host various events about human trafficking 101 events or food related events. What is happening in the coffee supply chain? What is happening in the tea supply chain, the chocolate supply chain? And how does that impact us as consumers, as purchasers, both for ourselves and individually or for the organizations that we work with? The hard truth is that there's 148 goods, commodities, many agricultural, that are implicated by forced labor across the globe. And so we've had to learn through trial and error and a lot of investigation to really try to make sure that all of the materials that we are using are supporting a living wage for farmers, whether they're local farmers or farmers across the globe growing sugar cane and coffee and such. So it's been a wonderful journey. We've been at this since 2015, and we moved to Main Street a couple of years ago here in Durham, and are becoming really that community hub that we hoped that we would be, and bringing understanding of trafficking and resources to a lot of the organizations in our state who are addressing trafficking.
Awesome, thank you. And so it's about restaurants and trafficking, so either one of you would like to chime in. I had some questions that a lot of this has a lot of focus in hospitality for lodging. Are there any signs or things that you could share that a restaurant owner or restaurant staff should be made aware of beyond what would be applicable for both hotels and restaurants?
Yeah, I was thinking about that as we were kind of going through. I was like, yeah, we're very heavy on the lodging side of things. There have been so many cases of trafficking across the United States that have had forced labor happening within the restaurant. So if an owner is here listening to this presentation, there's a pretty strong sense that you're probably not trafficking your labor within your restaurant, but it does happen. And I think when it comes to within a restaurant and a bar situation, of course you're going to intersect with individuals who maybe being trafficked, maybe being groomed in that moment, and so a lot of these similar indicators would be equally important. But then also your cleaning staff, your subcontracting staff, whether that is in a construction project or whether it's in hiring out cleaning to come in and do a full deep clean of the kitchen of the restaurant. I think those are the kind of situations where you really want to be paying attention. Donna, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say that absolutely, like we've already mentioned, reconfirming the status of the contractors and the work that they, who they're hiring, what their processes are, especially with non-English speakers would be really important. But I think the other thing too is in a restaurant or bar environment. And I think one of the resources I sent you, Samantha, one of those links will go into more indicators for those environments specifically. But some of the things to look for, there's the part where, like as Brian just said, with the hiring and the staff that may be trafficked, right, by these subcontractors. But there's also what you might observe in that bar or restaurant, right? So is there a situation where there's a something that you observe that there's a couple that are eating and one seems very in any kind of interaction that you're able to either overhear or observe seems more of controlling the conversation, controlling what's being communicated in any regard. Maybe we see some of those indicators that we mentioned as far as, some of the psychological factors, a very submissive demeanor, that kind of thing. Maybe there's a wide age difference between the individuals that are at the table. Is there someone that seems to be waiting in a bar environment, for example, to be picked up? Is there potentially some soliciting that seems to be going on? Is there a situation where individuals are, leaving and returning, and there seems to be some type of active and ongoing potential situation? So there are other indicators as well. I know we don't have a lot of time left, but on that particular link that I sent, there will be different ones that apply more specifically to the different environment someone might be in, or the role they may have, job may have.
Fantastic. And does some of these trainings in other languages beyond English for those of our member locations that may want these trainings in, let's say, Spanish?
That's a really good question. We don't have one available here with the task force. However, I think that if you checked in with the resource page, those links there may be Spanish options, whether that's through Polaris or ECPAT or the Safe Action Group. They all offer training in many, or even Blue Campaign. Many times there is a Spanish option.
Awesome. And then the last question I got was, you had mentioned about publicizing training. Have you seen any organization do a good job of this? You might want to share tips of like how they can spread the word that they have done this training, that their staff members are trained on these signs to their customers.
Put included on the website. I think that there's a place. Obviously, we talked about what they could do at the front desk or, in the rooms themselves, and that's important for sure. That helps get the word out as well. But I think putting it on your website and in any literature that's printed in some way, shape, or form would be really important. And that like I said, there are people that are looking for that. And, just framing it as a very positive a means to make sure that the hotel or restaurant is a safe environment, that we are proactive, and not so much, oh, this is happening here. Let me just say, I mean, there are cities in New Hampshire, I'll just say this, where police departments have told us that it's not, again, to reiterate, just at like maybe the lower end establishments, it's everywhere. I've had certain, a detective here in well, I'll just say one of our larger cities, say that every single hotel they have had a trafficking situation. So it crosses the board. And I think for me as a consumer, as a potential guest, the fact that someone's taking that proactive stance, and granted, of course, I'm more aware of trafficking than perhaps the average person. I understand that. But I think that wouldn't be a deterrent. It would be something that would encourage people I want to support that. And I think, I don't know, maybe Brian, you could speak to this too, but my experience with, let's just say younger generations than myself has also just, we're all making our decisions on, you know, cost, of course, is important, and other things. But I think that there's decisions being made on goods and services that we consume that are go beyond just getting the best price for something. And so making any of those things more apparent and visible, I think is really valuable and important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that part of the question, Samantha, was how do we get this content into the hands of other staff? And of course, we have this recording now. It's really probably most oriented towards a general manager or a higher management personnel who is making decisions. But being able to take some of the resources, or even creating that policy for your place of lodging, for your restaurant, and then being able to have that. I know time is absolutely, it's hard for me to even get the meetings in with my staff, to get them all there at the same time, to get information out. And so being able to break that down into a moment of, hey, we're implementing this policy, we want to sit down and let what we're specifically looking for, what your responsibilities are as a staff, and here is access to this full training if you would like to get more deep, but here are the indicators that we're looking for. Getting those indicators into people's hands, and then giving people their response and what they need to do. In 15 minutes, you can get a bulk of your counter team or your hospitality greeting team to really understand what they're looking for, and then revisiting that at a couple times a year with other policies that you're trying to maintain within your space. Just kind of incorporating it into the regular training up for your business is going to be the best way to keep it at the forefront of people's minds.
And I think that it really hits the nail on the head, is the consistency of it as well. Doing one
Absolutely.
training in January and then not talking about it again for 5 years isn't really going to assist your staff as much as the ongoing, make this part of your ongoing training.
Yeah, absolutely. And if January is the month, it's National, Prevention and Awareness Month, and every January hitting that and just bringing it up and revisiting and improving on those policies, giving people an opportunity to talk about, hey, have you actually seen some of these things? How have we responded? Did it make a difference? What can we do further to support you in your job? Will be part of that ongoing conversation and training.
So thank you both so much. We greatly appreciate coming on with us, having these conversations. They're so important to have, and working with us to create this video, create this resource. So, I know that it's about that time to wrap up. So unless you guys have anything else you'd like to add, I just would want to thank you guys again for being part of this. And, I look forward to collaborating with you in the future and hearing more about, Brian, what you guys are doing over at the cafe.
Yeah, thanks so much, Samantha. Thanks, Donna. And if there are other, ways that you'd like to collaborate, I feel like I probably should be more in touch with you, Samantha. And hopefully this is the beginning of some longer term conversations.
That would be fantastic.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Samantha. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, I hope everyone has a great day, and I'm sure I'll be chatting with you soon.
Awesome.